The global markets assume a conflict with Iran looks like Iraq 2003. A million boots on the ground, and a decade of occupation. This is a dangerous financial illusion. The Pentagon isn't dusting off plans for an invasion. They are modernizing a forgotten playbook from April 18, 1988. It was called Operation Praying Mantis, a single 8-hour shift where the U.S. Navy erased half of Iran's operational fleet. Now, you would think that nuclear brinkmanship makes this impossible today. But you have to consider the card constraint. In a potential Trump strategy, the goal is blanket regime change through occupation, but regime collapse through suffocation. One surgical kinetic strike on the Karg Island oil terminal doesn't just start a war. It deletes 90% of Tehran's revenue in 45 minutes, forcing a sovereign default without a single American soldier crossing the border. Whenever the mainstream media screams war with Iran, your brain probably cuts to the same dusty B-roll. Abrams tanks rolling through the desert, infinite columns of infantry, and a 20-year invoice approaching $3 trillion. That is the Iraq 2003 hallucination. And for a second Trump term, that model isn't just outdated, it's financially toxic. The global markets are still betting on a clumsy, sprawling occupation. They assume that to hurt Tehran, you have to put boots on the ground in Tehran. This creates a massive blind spot. The Pentagon isn't dusting off plans for an invasion. They've shifted to a hinge point strategy. The logic is brutal and efficient. Why pay to occupy a country when you can simply bankrupt it from 40,000 feet? This is theoretical. We have a historical receipt for exactly this kind of disproportionate violence. April 18, 1988. Operation Praying Mantis. Most Americans have forgotten this day, but the Iranian leadership definitely hasn't. In retaliation for a mine strike, the U.S. Navy didn't launch a drawn-out campaign or a frantic diplomatic summit. They simply clocked in for a single 8-hour shift. By the time they clocked out, they had sunk or crippled half of Iran's operational navy. It was distinct from the Iraq model in every way that matters. It was high-tech, it was low-risk, and it was over before the evening news cycle. That is the blueprint. The objective is finite regime change through occupation. Its regime collapses through suffocation. Trump's strategy relies on replicating that 1988 efficiency, striking hard enough to delete the state's revenue, but fast enough to avoid the political quagmire of a forever war. Now, you would think that nuclear brinksmanship makes this impossible today, but you have to consider the Karg constraint. The Karg constraint is a geography problem that Tehran can't solve. Karg Island is a rocky outcrop 25 kilometers off the coast. It's tiny, but that rock handles 90% of Iran's crude oil exports. It is the single point of failure for the entire regime's wallet. This sounds absurd right now, but I promise it'll make sense in exactly 2 minutes. Here is the mechanics of the strike. Trump doesn't need to land Marines on the beach or seize territory. He just needs to sever the loading jetties. These are specific, fragile structures where supertankers dock. You hit the Sea Island terminal on the west side and the T-jetty on the east. In under an hour, you have effectively sanctioned the country back to the Stone Age without passing a single law. And this is where the 1988 comparison gets scary. During Operation Praying Mantis, the U.S. Navy needed a full workday to cripple Iran's fleet using standard surface warfare. Today, the gap in air superiority means that timeline collapses. We aren't talking about a naval skirmish anymore. We are talking about 5th-generation stealth fighters and standoff munitions executing a demolition job before the Iranian air defense radars even refresh. It's maximum economic damage with zero political footprint, no occupation, no forever war, just a smoking terminal and a bankrupt government. But here is where the real nightmare starts for Tehran. It's not the craters in the ground, it's the silence in the bank accounts. We call this Phase 3. The cascade. Once those oil terminals are offline, the Iranian economy doesn't just stumble. It enters cardiac arrest. Oil isn't merely a line item for them, it is the entire bloodstream of the state. Cut that artery, and the rial doesn't just devalue, it evaporates. We are talking about hyperinflation that makes 1920s Germany look manageable. Now, forget the idea of a long, drawn-out civil war. We aren't waiting for a starving populace to organize a revolution. We are looking strictly at the enforcers. The Islamic Republic survives solely on the backs of the IRGC and the besieged militia. But these men aren't just religious ideologues. They are employees with families to feed. Here is the scale of the disaster. Imagine if the United States government suddenly lost the ability to pay the entire U.S. Army, the FBI, and every local police department overnight. No delays, no IOUs, just zero balance. How long until the guards walk away from the gates? How long until the Secret Service stops showing up? In Iran, that timeline is measured in days. With the currency worthless, the supreme leader can't print his way out of this. You get a scenario where the guys holding the AK-47s realize their loyalty check just bounced. This triggers a specific kind of collapse. Not a war of attrition, but a sudden, terrifying power vacuum. The specialized units dissolve to protect their own neighborhoods. The theological grip slips because the real notes in their pockets have turned into confetti. The result isn't an American flag raised over Tehran. It's a dystopian implosion. A state suffocating not from lack of air, but from a total payroll failure. This isn't a distant hypothetical waiting for 2030. We are standing in the lobby of this scenario right now. You have to understand that Trump's original maximum pressure campaign was essentially the diplomatic beta test for this kinetic strategy. The goal back then was to strangle the economy until the payroll bounced. Phase 4 just swaps the sanctions pen for a bunker buster. It is the exact same mechanic, just accelerated from years to minutes. One starves the patient, the other stops the heart. And that brings us to the rhetorical question that usually gets laughed out of the situation room but demands an answer. If the money stops, who fills the void? Wall Street isn't asking that. The trading algorithms are currently pricing in a standard, drawn-out conflict. They're betting on oil spiking $10, maybe $20 a barrel, assuming a traditional tit-for-tat slugfest. They are hedging for inflation. They are completely exposed to a sudden, deflationary regime collapse. If the state simply evaporates because the checks stop clearing, you don't get a price spike. You get a vacuum. And vacuums are violent. And that vacuum isn't filled by World War III. That's the distraction. The mainstream analysis is obsessed with escalation ladders and 2003-style invasions, because that's the movie everyone has seen before. They are looking for tanks. They should be looking at the wire transfers. The real danger of a specific, targeted Trump strike isn't a long, grinding war. It's a hyper-accelerated sovereign default. If the strike package severs the specific economic arteries we just mapped out, you aren't looking at a military retaliation. You are looking at a nation of 88 million people losing the ability to transact in 48 hours. Imagine the collapse of the Soviet Union, but compressed into a single weekend. The rial doesn't just inflate, it ceases to function as a store of value entirely. The IRGC doesn't launch a massive counteroffensive, not because they don't want to, but because the payment infrastructure required to fuel the trucks and pay the commanders has evaporated. The checks bounce. The loyalty dissolves. You get a failed state sitting on a nuclear stockpile, crumbling faster than the UN can schedule a meeting. That is the scenario nobody is pricing in. Everyone is hedging for $150 oil, while the real risk is a total liquidation event. Most channels will tell you where the aircraft carriers are parking. That's easy. We track the invisible plumbing, the defaults, the liquidity crunches, and the systemic failures that happen before the first shot is fired. If you want to understand the mechanics of the next crisis, rather than just reacting to the headlines, you need to be subscribed. Hit the button. Let's watch the money, not just the missiles. Here is the terrifying truth. We are viewing this scenario from a safe distance. We are standing on the precipice of it right now. The financial dominoes are already lined up. If a targeted strike forces the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, the resulting energy shock wipes out over $4 trillion in global GDP. That isn't just a statistic. That is the equivalent of the entire German economy vanishing overnight. But if that capital evaporates, who steps in to fill the void? This leaves us with one critical question. Is the global system resilient enough to survive the weaponization of its own reserve currency? The difference between navigating a correction and drowning in a collapse is understanding the plumbing before the pipes burst. That is exactly what we dissect here. Subscribe, and let's stay ahead of the fallout.